Hello everybody, and welcome to this, my second of two videos on the Mamiya ZM. In the first video we looked at what all of the stuff on this camera is. In this video we're going to talk about how to use it. So the first thing we need to do, because this camera can do nothing whatsoever without batteries, is change the batteries. I have no idea how to do this because it's been so long since I've done it. Think that you just use your fingernails to lift up on the battery chamber right here. I can never remember which direction it goes. Okay, my fingers are not going to do it because I am a weak person. Let's see if I can do it with one of my keys. There we go. That tripped it. So basically you just have to push down on the release and then pull out this caddy, which carries two 357 class or A76, S76 LR44 batteries in them. Positive terminal up for both of them. That means if you're holding the caddy like this, you can read the text on both of these. This is the underside of it. And then it slides in, and there's only one way that this can go into the camera. Like that, until it clicks into place. And that is how you change the batteries on the camera. Next thing let's do is talk about mounting and unmounting lenses and lens compatibility. This is a Z series lens. To remove it, you push the lens release button and turn it counter or anti-clockwise until it comes off and you can remove it. It's the exact same functionality as a Canon EF mount. So to mount the lens, you look for the index here and the index here, and you line those up, and then you just turn it clockwise until it clicks. Neat thing about the Z series cameras, even though it's not marked on any of them after the ZE, is that if you have older camera lenses, Mamiya lenses from the NC series, this is an NC series lens, you can mount these. Look for the lens index here, and there's on the ZE, the original, there's an index down here somewhere around this screw, and you line that index up with that spot, and then you turn it clockwise. And now, even though it doesn't align properly, you can now use your older NC series lenses. They do not have the electronic contacts to communicate with the camera, so they're a little bit crippled, but you can still use them. Yeah, so you can mount the NC lenses on the ZM. However, it will not stop the lenses down. It will only let you shoot them wide open. So that's one of the ways in which this camera cripples the old NC lenses. Next thing we're going to do is load and unload film and talk about how it moves through the camera. To open the film back, you simply lift up on the film rewind knob. There we go. We're going to grab our roll of film. Now you can see on the film rewind knob there are a couple of forks right here. Those forks connect with the spool inside of the film cassette. And that's what allows you to rewind the film when it's done. We're going to pull out a leader and feed it into the film take-up spool. We're going to advance, and now we know it's being taken up. You can, at this point or after you close the film back, take any slack out of the film cassette, and we'll see why we do that in just a second. Close the film back. Now we're going to advance until we get to frame 1, and you'll know that your film is being taken up if the film rewind knob and lever turn as you advance the film. As the film is taken up through the camera, the mechanical coupling between the forks on this and the spool inside the cassette mean that this turns when the film is pulled off of the cassette. So that's a fail-safe, just to know that your film is being taken up. So basically, you go through the day and you're just going to take a bunch of pictures, okay? And I'm going to show you next what that looks like inside of your camera. Film is one and done. It can record light exactly one time. In a controlled manner, with a proper shutter speed and aperture that give you an image, or in an uncontrolled manner by opening up the film back like this, which will erase any photos you have taken and prevent the film from being usable for future photos. But I think it's important to understand what happens inside your camera when you take a picture. After the shutter fires, you advance the film, which also rearms the shutter, and the film is pulled through the camera, taken up on the take-up spool. So when you've finished shooting for the day, before you open your film back, of course, because you cannot open your film back when the film is in it unless it is inside the cassette, when you're done shooting, you push down on the film rewind button, and then you start rewinding your film. And this is how you rewind your film after you're done shooting, and this is what happens inside the camera. You'll feel a change in tension and probably hear that sound through the camera body when you get to the end. And at that point, what you want to do is just rewind a bunch of times until you've completely taken up your film inside your cassette. And then you pull the cassette out of the chamber here, and if you're going to shoot another one, just drop it in. If you're not going to, you push this closed and trigger the shutter button. Now remember, you cannot open the film back until you have completely rewound the film. And one thing I also forgot to mention at the time is after you load your film, be sure to adjust your ASA to the film's speed. So if you're shooting 400 ISO film, set this to 400, which it is set to. ASA and ISO are the same number. So 400 ASA is the same as 400 ISO. That's how you load and unload film and what happens inside your camera when film is passing through it. All right, next thing we're going to do is talk about flash use on this camera. This camera does not have a flash PC port, so the only place you can put a flash is up here on the hot shoe. The flash sync speed is 1/60th of a second and slower. Now, when a shutter in a camera like this is triggered, the first curtain opens and the second curtain then closes, and when you advance the film, they reset. The shutter speed is not controlled by how quickly the curtains move, but by how big the gap is between them. So at 1/1000th of a second, the first curtain will go, and then the second will follow closely behind it. At 1 full second, the first curtain will go, and then the entire film will be exposed to light for a full second before the second curtain goes, and then you advance the film and reset the curtains. At 1/60th of a second, that's the fastest speed at which the first curtain is open, and the entire film is exposed to light. So that's the point at which the flash is triggered. The light reaches your subject, comes back to the lens, is focused on the film, and in a perfect world, you have a properly illuminated photo taken with a flash before the second curtain closes, and then you advance the film. If you were to fire the camera with the flash at 1/1000th of a second, the first curtain would go, the second curtain would come in right behind it very closely, the first curtain would finish its travel, and then what was in that little thin gap between the curtains would be illuminated by the light. Everything else would be blocked by the shutter curtain and blank on the film, so that at shutter speeds faster than 1/60th of a second, there is no time during those exposures at which the entire film plane is exposed to light and can have a flash triggered. That's why the sync speed is a maximum of the shortest possible exposure of 1/60th of a second. So one drawback to this camera is that the only place to put the flash is on top of it. So if you're looking at getting a flash for this camera, the worst possible way to mount a flash is to have it on top of your camera pointing directly forward. The light will reach your subjects, bounce off of them, go back to the lens, and it will make them look flat and waxy and unflattering. When you're using a flash, you want to mimic the way that we see light on a day-to-day basis. The sun is above us. Lights in buildings are above us. So you want to articulate your flash upward, bounce the light off the ceiling, back to your subject, and then back to your lens. And that will have your flash mimic the way that we see people and subjects naturally. So if you're going to buy a flash for this lens, any X-type flash will work. Those are ones that are still made today. They've been made since the 60s. You could get an old Vivitar or similar type of flash, or you could buy a brand new one. Because this is a basically a manual flash. You can buy the cheapest flash you can find with manual controls. One thing you want to do is make sure that it has an articulating head so you can point it upwards, and also ideally a rotating head so that you can point it off to the side if you want to, and kind of control your light a little bit that way. All right, so the next thing we're going to talk about is how to use this AEL function on the shutter dial. First thing to know is that it only works when you are in A mode to begin with. So what you do for AEL is you're going to set the aperture rather, on your lens, because A mode is aperture priority. So basically you just pick what aperture you would like, and then aperture priority works. Let's say that you are sitting in a scene where you and your friend are underneath an awning and behind you is a beach. The light under the awning is significantly different than the light on the beach. If you just took a picture of your friend with the light behind them, then what would happen is that your friend would be in a dark shadow, and then the scene behind them, the beach, would be properly illuminated. So what you need to do is lock your automatic exposure. To do that, you would point the lens, let's say, down at the table that you're sitting at. You would hold down the shutter halfway, switch to AEL, recompose, bring the camera back up to put your friend in front of the beach, and take the picture, all without releasing the shutter button from its half-depressed position. When you do that, that will lock in your automatic exposure for taking a photo of your friend. One of the advantages to doing it this way versus switching to a manual shutter speed would be that this method is stepless. So any shutter speed, 1/754th, could be used if that's the proper shutter speed. That's the same advantage versus using the exposure compensation dial to do the exact same thing. So let's say, for instance, that 1/60th of a second is the proper exposure to get your friend illuminated, and 1/250th is the proper exposure for the beach. I'm showing you this on the dial just so you can see the relationship between them. That's 2 stops difference, which is the same here as +2 stops on the EV. What you could do is set the A to aperture priority and give yourself 2 stops more light. That will mean that if the meter says 1/250th, it will actually give you 1/60th. But that's only in full stops. Doing it this way will give you a stepless shutter adjustment. So that's the difference between those two. The EV compensation dial will work in A mode to adjust the shutter speed in aperture priority mode. This gives you a slower shutter speed, more light. This gives you less shutter speed, faster shutter speed for less light. So basically, if you're in a place where you are dark and the background is bright, you need to give yourself more light. If you're in a place where you are in a bright area and the background is darker, you need to give yourself a little bit less light. And that will sort of balance the exposure between the person in front of you and the background. So let's go over everything we've talked about, and let's see how to take a photo with this camera. So you have a full manual mode right here, which is any of these shutter speeds plus your aperture. Basically what you want to do is look through the viewfinder, figure out what your settings are, and the viewfinder has a list of shutter speeds down this side. There's a solid line which tells you what your a solid dot rather, which tells you what your setting is, and a flashing dot that tells you what it should be. As you adjust your aperture, that flashing dot will change. As you adjust your shutter speed, that solid dot will change. So if you're at 1/60th and you have the solid dot there, and you have a flashing dot at 1/500th, you can either adjust your aperture to bring that flashing dot down to 1/60th, or adjust your shutter speed to bring the solid dot up to 1/500th. And then all you have to do at that point is focus and take your picture. And that's how you take a picture in manual mode. If you want to use aperture priority, all you have to do is set your aperture to whatever you want it to be, focus, and take a picture, and the camera will select the best shutter speed for you. The Z lenses have this little lock button here, right? Which allows the camera to pick the best shutter speed, right? Not on the ZM. This aperture dial lock is for the ZEX, and all it will do on the ZM is mess up your exposures. So with the ZM, you want to be using the aperture dial yourself, regardless of what mode you're using, whether it's aperture priority or manual. And that's it. That's all there is to take a picture with this camera. It's a very easy process. So what about double exposures? Double exposures are pretty easy to do with this camera. We'll go over them in full manual as well as aperture priority. But first, let's talk a little bit about the mechanics of the double exposure. So let's say that your double exposure, so let's say that a proper exposure is 1/125th of a second at f/6. You take a picture, you advance the film, you have a proper single exposure on your film. If you have your film and you properly expose it, you have a good negative. If you properly expose the same part of the film twice, your negative will become what's called dark, thick, or dense, meaning you have put too much light on it. And that will give you a negative which takes a long time to print in the darkroom and has low contrast, or if you scan it, has a lot of digital noise and low contrast. So it's a good idea to have a good practice for taking double exposures. And in order to do a double exposure, you have to cut the amount of light in half. So there are two ways to do that. If our proper exposure is 1/125th at f/6, we can either cut the amount of light in half by adjusting the shutter speed, which would take us to, since these are fractions, 1/250th. The higher number is less. 1/250th is half the time as 1/125th of a second. Or we can adjust the aperture. And again, fractions, f/6. f8 is half as much light as f/6. So let's say we're going to adjust it with the shutter speed. We'll take our first picture. But if we just advance, then all we've done is taken one underexposed frame. So we'll take our first picture. Next, we're going to hold down the film rewind button and the film rewind knob, and then advance the film. And then we take our second film frame and advance. One thing about cameras is that when you start advancing after doing a double exposure like that, the gears don't engage instantly. So you're not done with your double exposure. You need to take your lens cap, pop it on here, drop this to f16, put your shutter speed at 1/1000th, and take a dead frame. Now the reason is, when I say that your first exposure doesn't advance all the way, if you don't do a dead frame, your next photo will partially overlap your double exposure and ruin both of them. But the dead frame allows that double exposure to move completely out of the way, so your next photo can proceed and be taken properly. Okay, what about double exposures in auto mode? That's really easy to do. Set your EV compensation dial to -1. Take your first photo. Then exact same process for advancing the film. Take your second photo. Advance the film. Lens cap. Dead frame. Move on. Remember to turn your EV dial back to 0, because that will make sure that the rest of your photos are properly exposed. And that's it. That is everything that we had to go over with the Mamiya ZM, the penultimate Mamiya 35mm Z series camera, the penultimate Mamiya 35mm camera. Thank you for watching this video. Please give me a thumbs up. That lets me know that I'm on the right track producing content which is useful and helpful to you. If you have any questions or comments, please leave those in the comments section below. I'm pretty good about checking these every couple of days and answering questions. If you have any suggestions or ideas for future videos, and if I have the technical know-how and equipment, I'm more than happy to make those. One last thing. Thank you everyone for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. I gotta get up, Steinbeck. I have to turn off the camera.